Good evening and welcome to the Creative Campus at Liverpool Hope University. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities here, Nick Rees, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the university on behalf of the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Gerald Pillay, and indeed my colleagues. I just want to say a few words about the faculty in the Creative Campus, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Kapler, to introduce our speaker for this evening. The Creative Campus here, which you may not have seen terribly in the dark, but hopefully if you saw a little bit of it, you'll come back and see it in the daytime as well, is our creative and performing arts campus here at Liverpool Hope University. And it's the campus that brings together the departments of music, drama and dance, and fine and applied arts. So it's very much our performing areas. And it constitutes about a half of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. The traditional departments of humanities, which includes politics, history, media communication, theology, religious studies, and English, are all based at Hope Park. So we're very much located over two sites, and our students move back and forth during the day, and indeed some of you are our students, so you'll be well aware of that. This is, as I said, a performing arts campus. But actually, the theme that we're going to be looking at tonight in our Civic Peace Lecture is one that unites the faculty, in that quite a number of areas draw upon it for inspiration in their research and in their interests. So in lots of ways, it's appropriate that we should hold the lecture here at the Creative Campus, and we should be on the edge of the city centre. The Creative Campus is very much an attractive and vibrant learning environment, with students studying and living together in a community, which again is something we very much emphasise at Liverpool Hope University. We place a special emphasis on being a community where we have a commitment to educating our students in mind, body and spirit, and this is reflected in the events like the Cornerstone Festival, the Fine Arts Degree Show, our dining in nights, and our work with external partner organisations across the city. And I hope that you'll see some of that this evening whilst you're here. The physical fabric of the campus is one made up of several buildings, including halls of residence. And again, you will see this evening just the capstone building here, which is home principally to the Department of Music, but is also a theatre in here that's used for performing arts generally. But later, for those of you who are staying for dinner, you'll go over to the Cornerstone building, which houses our fine art and our drama and dance departments, and you'll get a feeling of the fabric of the place at that stage. So it is quite a vibrant campus, and I'm quite delighted that we're hosting the event here this evening. Our objective, again, I think, is to be very much a part of the city in this campus and to be integrated into it. That's reflected to some degree in our partnerships too with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra, National Museums Liverpool, FACT, Film and Creative Technology Centre, and indeed with Blue Coat Galleries. So in lots of ways you can see the sort of things we do here. Tonight we're going to have a civic lecture, our peace lecture, by a very distinguished guest, Professor Johan Galtung. I'm going to ask my colleague Dr. Kapler to introduce him in a second. Dr. Kapler is director of our Centre for War and Peace Studies, which is our Desmond Tutu Centre, of which we're very proud. And on a personal note, I'm delighted that Professor Galtung has come to Liverpool tonight to give this lecture and that colleagues are able to join us here for this event. Because for me, certainly, when I was a PhD student, Professor Galtung's work was extremely influential in my own PhD research, and I know a lot of my fellow graduate students when I studied in the States. So I hope that the theoretical insight and also the practical application of his work, which I saw as a student, will inspire you this evening and lead you forward. I'm not going to say any more about it because I think at this stage I should hand over to Dr. Kapler. But you're very welcome to the Creative Campus of Liverpool Hope University. Dr. Kapler.
Thank you very much, Nick. And a very warm welcome to all of you who are able to attend here. I know that many of you have come from far away, some of you even from abroad. So I'm very grateful to see so many of you here, and I'm sure we'll have a very delightful evening. It is my enormous privilege to introduce our speaker, Johan Galtung, to you tonight, whom all of you probably know through his very, very influential work. And I think Professor Galtung's work really connects to the mission that we have with the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Centre for War and Peace Studies, which is very much an interdisciplinary centre. And again, from Professor Galtung's own background, you will know that he's a mathematician by training, and I guess the projection here already gives you a hint of that. He's also a sociologist and a political scientist, so he's really managed to cross disciplines and disciplinary boundaries as well. He is the founder of the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo, which is a very established research institute. And he's very influential in the academic world. He has been very influential and still is influential in the work that you find in different disciplines, but mainly in the discipline of peace studies. He is a professor for peace studies at different universities all over the world. And just to list a few of those: Columbia, Oslo, Berlin, Belgrade, Paris, Santiago de Chile, Buenos Aires, Cairo, Sichuan, Ritz-Jamaica, Princeton, Hawaii, Bern, Alicante, and many, many others on really different continents all over the world. It is also interesting to know that he has published more than 1,500 articles and more than 160 books, some of which you will find when you leave this hall, and some of which you can also purchase and perhaps get signed by Professor Galtung. So there is hardly any article about in the discipline of peace studies where he is not cited because of his extremely influential work. You may have heard about his concepts of positive and negative peace, concepts of structural violence, which have really been very influential in so many ways. He's also the founder of the Transcend Peace University, which is an online university for peace studies, as well as the director of Transcend International, which is a global network which reaches out to different countries all around the world. But not just in the academic world, also in the practitioner world has he really gained a lot of influence, having mediated in over 100 conflicts all over the world between states, nations, religions, civilizations, communities, and people. So he has been very influential in conflict resolution, in mediation, in reconciliation alike. And he has received over a dozen of honorary doctorates and professorships, and many other distinctions, one of those being the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize, which is also the Right Livelihood Award. So I would like to maximize his time as a speaker, and I'll stop here, although there is much more to say about him. But I'd like to maximize his time to speak to you tonight, and I want to really welcome him to speak to you, and I hope you've got a delightful evening. Thank you very much.
Well, dear Dr. Rees, dear Dr. Kapler, I'm delighted to be at the university I have saved for such a long time. After traveling around the world, I've come to the Liverpool Hope. So I'm very grateful to you, and I love the name Hope. And when I come with this kind of formula, or this kind of work in my mediation, the general comment I get is not that we necessarily accept all your ideas immediately, but you give us hope. And that's important, hope and optimism. And I find hope all over the map of Liverpool. I live in Hotel Hope, and it happens to be in the Hope district, it seems. I have already suggested to Stephanie Kapler that she has to change her name to Stephanie Hope, but she says it's not so quite obvious. Now, having said that, let us look at the formula. You have a sheet of paper. And the point about the formula is, of course, that you have 4 components. There is a numerator and a denominator. And what I have to do first now is simply to do the boring work of definitions and then inundate you with examples and how to apply it. Equity. Cooperation for mutual and equal benefit. So the key words are "and equal." The trick about capitalism is that it is for mutual benefit, but it was never intended to be equal. There is built-in inequality in the market system. The more assets you can put into the market, the more you can take out. And if little you have, less will you get. And that's already written up in the Gospels according to St. Matthew and to St. Luke. It's called the Matthew Principle. Cooperation for mutual and equal benefit. Equity is that. Harmony. There is a definition of harmony which I take from Taoism. And the definition is to suffer the suffering of the other and to enjoy the joy of the other. Now, for that you need empathy. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other and feel the suffering and the joy. So let us now say that we have cooperation for mutual and equal benefit. And here the golden rule, positive version, is quite useful. Do unto others what you like them to do unto you. But the definition I gave of empathy harmony goes a little bit further. It's not a question of an exchange market. I'm so clever that I want you to do something good to me, and I never have to pay a price by doing something good to you. The thing about harmony is more emotional. So imagine you do those two. You have a recipe for a good marriage. I can see from the age of the audience that marriage is not an unknown institution. So you can check your own against it. Equity, partnership is another word for it. What's the feminist message? Very, very important. Stephanie kindly mentioned that I have published more than 150 books and I have mediated more than 150 conflicts, some of them being marital around the world. And I have found couples that take great pleasure in the suffering of the other and suffer very much at the joy of the other party. You may say the marriage is on the rocks, but doesn't have the pleasing composition of whiskey on the rocks. It's a marriage on the rocks. So you may say it doesn't sound very promising. I don't necessarily draw that conclusion. I have a kind of system of 20 items where I am checking whether there is some love. Because you see, the thing I just mentioned is what happens in conflict. You polarize, you dehumanize. And even the person you are married to is no longer a human person. It's an object. And you enjoy the suffering, and you suffer the joy. In other words, what has happened is not necessarily a lasting relationship, but it is what happens to human beings in conflict. We polarize and we escalate. Now, in marriages, that would usually take the form of verbal violence, starting with quarrels, then the abuse comes. And after some time, it is clearly better if they don't meet. And the worst thing a mediator can do is to bring them together. A mediator talks with one at a time. But what I mentioned, if you have those two, equity and harmony, it's not a bad formula for a good marriage, but watch out, there is a denominator in this fraction. Trauma and conflict. Now, trauma are the traces of the violence of the past, verbal or physical. And don't underestimate the violence of the body language. Conflict is the threat of violence that may come out of the conflict in the present. I mentioned that where we have conflict, we tend to get polarization and we tend to get escalation. Escalations means higher and higher levels of violence. The highest levels are called genocide. Against nature, it is called ecocide. And against other societies, I introduced the term sociocide, killing a society. That's what colonialism was about. And one way of doing colonialism was to steal people and sell them as slaves. I just mention it, I don't elaborate, I'm just saying that that was one way of doing sociocide. Now, in the relation between two persons who are close to each other, there will always have been something in the past. And there may be daily conflicts that come up every day. There may be small problems, but one wants this and another one wants that, and they don't go together. How do we handle that? Well, to start with, we have two words. We handle trauma by means of reconciliation, and we handle conflict by means of resolution. Catholics and Protestants, Northern Ireland, Liverpool. Resolution, reconciliation, not the same thing. Reconciliation is about the past. Resolution is the present and the future. Let me say a couple of words about them, and I'll do that now, immediately, and then I take examples. We first have to define conflict. And here Anglo-Americans are often at a loss because they have a tendency to use that marvelous language, believing that conflict and violence are about the same thing. Well, they are two different words. They look different in written form and phonetically quite different. And they stand for quite different things. That's why you have two different words. Conflict may lead to violence, but is not identical with it. So what is conflict? Incompatible goals. I want this, you want that. It doesn't gel. I want this, I also want that. So let us say that I'm talking to a student at the University of California in one of the 8 campuses. And he wants 2 things. He is fantastic at skateboarding, up and down and all kinds of things. And at the same time, in the new age, he wants meditation. And this is the 2 as excluding each other. Now, I found that a relatively easy one. My recommendation was to meditate while skateboarding. It's only that in his mind they didn't come together. Now let us say that you somehow are attracted by socialism and you define socialism as satisfying basic needs, starting at the bottom. But you're also attracted to capitalism because it's so entrepreneurial, so filled with new things and new ideas. But in your mind they don't come together. You have the mind of a US senator, and I can guarantee you they don't come together. But let us say that you have a Chinese mind. They call their economic system copy communism or commu-capitalism, depending on the hour of the day. And how do they do it? They lift the bottom up. 400 million, 14 years between 1991 and 2004. They're now working on the second 400 million. It's never happened before in human history. When I went into the ministry responsible for it to try to find out their tricks, they said, we'll tell you how you do it, but we'll first tell you one thing. You are the first Westerner who has asked us. The third world lines up. And when I read English press, you see, I don't use the word British and Britain so often because I never recognized this thing about Scotland. I think London can take that relatively easily that I didn't recognize it, but anyhow, I didn't quite. So I refer to England. If I read the English press, and I read columns written by the China experts, I'm not mentioning their names, I find total, complete ignorance about lifting 400 million up. No, that doesn't work. You see, what is the solution to conflict? Combining the uncombinable. Combining the uncombinable. Now, to do that, you usually have to change reality a little bit. The skateboarder has to be so good that he does his skateboarding sort of automatically and does meditation at the same time. And the US senator will have to change his mind a little bit. There are, as a matter of fact, a couple of US senators in the UK Parliament too. I'll not mention names. But they do exist. Combining the uncombinable. Ecuador and Peru, a terrible, very belligerent conflict from 1941 to 1995, 54 years. About 500 square kilometers up in the Andes, Ecuador saying, that is mine, Peru saying, that is mine. Now, that gives you a little point. To have the same goal doesn't mean you have solved anything. That you have different goals doesn't mean that you are in a conflict. To have the same goal, if you have two men in love with the same woman, they may have exactly the same goal, but they may be mutually exclusive unless you are French and believe in ménage à trois. I'll not elaborate. I'll just mention that there is a cultural factor, a mental factor, and so on. Okay, they had 4 wars about where to draw the border. Because that's one way of solving a conflict, by compromise. And it didn't work. The ex-president who had mediated the last armistice, ceasefire, was put together with me by the Guatemalan Foreign Ministry. And he asked me, Professor Galtung, how do we draw the line? And I said, Your Excellency, maybe by not drawing any line. Maybe by running that territory together. As a 2-state region, 2-state zone, with a natural park. In Spanish, that is zona biestadal, parque natural. And I have as a rule, when I suggest something to politicians, never more than 4 words. If you can manage with 2, even better. If you take more than 4 words, they'll forget one of them and they will insert a not to make the sentence longer and things of that kind. So be careful. And I have been talking with some public relations experts, and sometimes I admire their work. And the people who make headlines in newspapers, titles. Well, the ex-president said, very creative, Professor Galtung, but too creative. I have been 30 years at the conferences for peace. Nobody has ever proposed that. It will take 30 years just to get used to it, and 30 years to practice it. We don't have 60 years. Don't you have something more practical? 3 years later, that was the formula, even with the words that I had suggested. In the Treaty of Peace in Brasilia, that was 1998. And after that, there hasn't been one act of violence in the zone, but they did better than I proposed. Not a natural park, but an economic zone. Transnationals came in and created problems with the nature, as they usually do. Now, from that, of course, we learned one thing, and what I try to do is to convince people who are lost in a tunnel called a conflict that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I remember once in London, I got a very good question. Okay, Professor Galtung, you suggest there is light at the end of the tunnel, and when people come out of that tunnel, what do they find? I said, a new tunnel. Now, if in the meantime you have learned something about how to solve conflicts, you will be better capable of solving it. So you enter a tunnel, it's dark. The question is to hack a hole and make light at the end of the tunnel, to enter a new tunnel, and that process is called history. There is a name for it. In other words, there is no final sunny landscape with no problems. But we can handle conflicts and reduce the suffering from violence immensely by doing a better job. So I've given an example, and let me now take something of what I mentioned and take it a little bit further. I mentioned that a new tunnel came at the zone up in the Andes, and the tunnel was due to the relationship to nature. Can we use this formula for peace with the nature? Let's start down at the bottom. Trauma is the harm we have done to nature. Nature is suffering. We can do good. And I think people who have immense capacity to do good are the foresters. We can plant trees, but please don't plant them in straight lines. Be so kind, do it more random, more the nature way. Don't be so inspired by military regiments in a parade that you plant the trees the same way. That's not nature's way. You can repair the damage from the past. But you could also maybe do better than the past, than nature did it. In other words, try to find out what is it nature wants. Well, that we know. Nature wants to reproduce itself. And in order to reproduce itself, nature needs diversity and it needs synthesis. The most famous synthesis, of course, being the photosynthesis. We better not do damage to that by reducing the diversity and by clouding with climate gases the possibility of photosynthesis, for instance. I could go much more into detail, but the point about it is that here we are down at trauma and conflict. Now, how do we build equity? Well, we take something out of nature. How good are we at giving something back on an equitable basis? And in order to understand what is equity, how good are we at harmony? That's simply having so much empathy with nature that we sense what nature needs. A farmer does, especially if the system is that his offspring will inherit the farm. Put the farm up on the market on a commercial basis, and you lose that inspiration. I think what has kept nature relatively well the 10,000 years we have been doing farming is exactly that principle. It doesn't have to be by primogeniture to the eldest son, not at all. Maybe also the siblings could invent a cooperative and run it together. But blood is thicker than water, and for that reason, to let equity to nature go through harmony with your successors is a very good formula. So I mentioned that we have here things that have very much to do with peace with nature. Now, let me give you an example. First of all, an example that you may not like to start with, but it is European Union. I'm not so much thinking of the European Union today. I'm thinking of the European Union 1st of January 1958, long before UK. UK has an unhappy relationship. So what was it they tried to do? They had a country in their midst, former Nazi Germany, and they had two French politicians, Schuman and Monnet, who had concocted a fantastic formula. You Germans have been so atrocious that you have to become members of the family. Rather brilliant. 1st of January 1958, the Treaty of Rome started. Equity, each country one vote. Minuscule Luxembourg, the same one vote as big Germany. But also economic equity. Be sure that you do it in such a way that the others derive as much benefit from it as you yourself. And if the others are not quite up to it, because of a very uneven level of development, raise them. The European District Fund. 4 countries later on became the candidates for that. Portugal and Spain, Ireland and Greece. But in the beginning, the 6 countries in the middle were more or less at the same level: Germany, Benelux, Italy, and France. Now, how about harmony? There's no doubt that relatively soon they developed a very big sense that if there is a big accident in one of the other member countries, we put our things together and we help. That harmony was an expression of, I suffer their suffering, and I enjoy their joy. In other words, it became less competitive. Now, how does UK relate to this? They were first got a no by de Gaulle. And de Gaulle was telling his fellow Europeans in that part of Europe that the English have strange habits at home. Now, he didn't care to spell it out, but we were all curious to know more about those strange habits from anthropologist Charles de Gaulle. But, you see, there is an enormous amount of trauma. Let us be aware of the fact 400 years of warfare between France and England. The English tradition of seeing the most powerful country on the continent automatically as its enemy, by definition. France and Germany had a test, and that test was 1870-71. England drew the conclusion of the enemy is Germany. That resulted in 2 world wars. But before that, with Hitler imitating Napoleon, the relationship to France had culminated in the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, culminating in Waterloo. You have a lot of trauma. There's also a lot of trauma on the continent. But the trauma accumulated in the relationship to England is considerable. Is there a lot of conflict? There is a major conflict. Finance. London. City of London. Thistle Road. It used to be a rather small road. And part of it migrated to Wall Street. And a famous English politician with the name Winston Churchill said that he could never make a decision before he had consulted with the cabal. What was the cabal? City of London plus Wall Street. Now, Wall Street is not in Europe, but there is a European central bank. And as you would expect, there is a conflict. That conflict is important. How about equity? Mutual benefit and equal benefit. Not impossible, but not so easy to work out. And standing in the way of harmony you have the traumas. But hasn't there been reconciliation? There has been some reconciliation. I'm coming back to it. But maybe not so deep. England is special. UK is special. And the relationship has not been an unproblematic one. If now the result of the referendum before year 2017 with a clear yes or no is a no, close your ears, because there will be a lot of applause on the continent. Yeah. So just be prepared to have something protection in your ears in advance, because there could be something mutual in this sentiment. Now, how about UK-US? Unsinkable aircraft carrier. The special relation. You can work it through, and you can look at it in different ways. There is a trauma. And the trauma lasted from 1775 to 1812. When people with red uniforms from what was not yet UK, because that came 1st of January 1801, and in a revised version 1st of January 1922, when they were marching on a certain road in the Massachusetts-Connecticut district, they were shot at. From behind windows and from behind hedges. And I didn't like it, because they didn't come out in the open, these people. It was guerrilla before Spain. Now, it took a lot of years. It would have been wiser for George III to see the handwriting on the wall. But it took a lot of years. And it took some years, maybe till the Second World War, before actually more equitable and harmonious relations came about. I think the trauma is a small one today, and I think the Anglo-American formula is good at solving conflict among themselves. But there is a problem. The problem is that the US empire is going very quickly down, and the US is losing on all 4 basic forms of power. It's an economic catastrophe, which they're only trying to solve by printing money. Printing money is not a lasting solution. They lose all the wars except against Haiti. Congratulations. Now, when they lost in 1953 to North Korea aided by China, the first war they had lost since 1812 to UK, the War of Independence. They had broken an unbroken line of victories. And they found North Korea an absolutely insolent country that didn't understand that the United States was invincible. And towards an invincible country, your damn duty is to capitulate. They didn't understand that. They hate the country. They started hating China, but China was a little bit too big for lasting hatred. So they made a formula. So much for wars. How about politics? The politics of an empire was exercised by having obedient elites that were paid well. They were, of course, all of them cloned by going to Cambridge, Oxford. They hadn't discovered Liverpool Hope yet. That'll come. And they were cloned successfully as English gentlemen, some of them ladies, and sent back. But that formula is today slipping. United States used to have only one enemy in Latin America, Cuba. They have today only one friend, Trinidad and Tobago. And Trinidad and Tobago is more a friend of Canada than of the US, actually. You know, that has happened during a span of 15 years. Quite remarkable. In 1980, I predicted that the Berlin Wall would come down within 10 years and the Soviet Empire would follow. And I had a very complicated theory to justify that. It was not exactly crystal ball. The wall came down, and it came down, in fact, 2 months ahead of time. So I got the cable from one of the audiences where I had been saying this, where very many of them. One was in Denmark, and then said, "Please, Johan, have a little bit more margin next time." Well, in year 2000, I predicted 2020 as the end of the US empire. It's on track. When that one goes down, it's no longer living off the rest of the world. It's an immensely rich country and immensely innovative. It has more than enough talent to manage itself. But old habits are difficult to change. If your name is UK and you are a dinghy attached to a sinking Titanic, it's an idea to have a long rope or an axe. So much for the US-UK relationship. Now, what is happening is the opposite. The unsinkable aircraft carrier coming to the assistance of trying to keep Western prevalence. For instance, in Libya, an entirely failed operation. And that failure is today followed up in Mali. I'm going to use that as an example for the 4 workshops tomorrow. So those who want to participate, have a little look at, Google a little bit. Don't look at your newspapers, please, but Google. I mentioned this, and of course it brings me to the United Kingdom of Northern Ireland, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Equity and harmony, trauma and conflict. Instead of spelling it out, because you all know what I could say now about those 4 words, and I could say it is not a catastrophe, it is not peace, it's somewhere in between. And one can discuss how far in between it is. Just take the flag conflict, for instance, in Belfast, as an example. And you have your version of it in the Liverpool area, the Catholic Protestant. We have one rule: reconciliation without resolution is called pacification. Don't do it. Don't say, shake hands, be good friends, smile to each other. So, photo opportunity, photographer, take the smile and the shaky hand. Shaken, I actually said shaky, because they are shaky hands. Resolution and reconciliation can go hand in hand. What happened to Germany, you see, it's quite interesting. The resolution was to become a fully fledged member of the European community. And to experience that 5 of the countries they had brutalized among the 25 countries in Europe by today's map. Brutalizing 4 nations. In numbers, the Russians first, then the Jews, then the Sinti Roma, then, if you call it a nation, the handicapped. Now, to be accepted after having done that was a resolution. And there was an enormous sigh of relief. And 10 years later came the reconciliation. And it came not by Bishop Tutu, whom I admire extremely much, and I'm very proud of standing in giving a talk under the aegis of his center. But under Gustav Heinemann, a German president, who said that the way to do it is to revise German textbooks. It's not to have a single speech by a president. We apologize. But to have a lasting apology in the textbooks. German textbooks were rewritten with a full confession on what they had done, the suffering of the victims, and a declaration of the new road they had chosen. And that road was called human rights democracy. Not a bad road. But the point about it was they wanted to expand it to the former victims. For that reason, they were always in favor of expanding the European community to include all the former victims. What is good for you may also be good for them. Now, I have not seen English textbooks of that kind. I have not seen it. I have seen in England a Holocaust Day 2 days ago. I have not seen a colonialism day. Holocaust is somebody else's crime and somebody else's suffering, roughly speaking. I called for the Colonialism Day and for the revision of English textbooks. I should say that the Germans were a little bit too thorough at it, so when I give lectures in Germany, sometimes somebody asks me, Professor Galtung, was there anything else happening during the Second World War than Auschwitz? And there were a couple of other things happening, I may say. So maybe the Germans exaggerated it, and that has backfired to some extent. People also want to be informed about Hamburg, Dresden. And people who commit crimes of state terrorism also want to be informed about terrorism, and vice versa. So having said that, we have made a little sweep through a couple of things. And since I just was at that point, how about Israel-Palestine? Couldn't be much worse. There is a trauma suffered by the Palestinians, the Nakba, the calamity, at the hands of the Israelis. Or to be more precise, a Jewish terrorist organization, headed by a coming Prime Minister Menachem Begin, Deir Yassin being the murder example of it, but most of it was sociocide and driving out 780,000 people. The Jews themselves had suffered one of the worst traumas in human history, the Shoah. The calamity is a mild expression for it. But it was not at the hands of the Arabs. It was at the hands of somebody else. Why didn't they take it out on somebody else? Well, somebody else was a little strong. There's also the argument that I made very often in the 1960s, totally unsuccessfully, where I suggested that Germany should give Baden to the Jews. That's about the same size as Israel. And I was told repeatedly when I lectured about this in Germany that, Professor Galtung, that would be impossible. And I said, I know it's impossible. But maybe what is happening now is impossible too. But I don't quite mean that. I'll give you my stand, which is very simple. I stand unequivocally for Israel as a state with Jewish characteristics, democratic, with equal rights between Jews and Arabs inside the state, including the right to become prime minister. Equal rights. When it comes to the borders, I would have preferred 1948, the UN resolution from 1947, Resolution 194, drawn up by a Swedish count, very famous in Norway because he saved 13,000 Norwegian concentration camp inmates, and 430 Jewish inmates in another concentration camp, Folke Bernadotte. He was murdered by the Stern gang by the orders of somebody called Yitzhak Shamir, who later on became prime minister. Now, these are unescapable facts. And the borders that I'm thinking of could have been until 1948. I'm actually thinking of something in between 1967, 4 June, and 1948. 1967, with a swap, part of Negev Desert to make a bridge, a land bridge, between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and cantons on the West Bank for Israel, and cantons in the northwest for Palestine. You can read about all of that, if you will, in a book called 50 Years, 100 Conflict Perspectives. There's one copy downstairs. I sign it with pleasure. And I can tell you from a recent talk I gave in Israel, where I have been 24 times, that an Israeli came up to me and said, Professor Galtung, I'm not very happy about your peace formula and your peace studies, but your signature may be worth something in some years. So I would just remind you of that one. The books are available for 10, 15, and 20 pounds, depending on the number of pages. Now, having said that, enormous trauma, total inability to solve the conflict, complete inability. Equity, there is none. Of harmony, nothing. Both of them will enjoy the suffering of the other, and both of them will suffer any triumph of the other. Israelis suffered immensely at the UN vote, 138 against 9, with 41 abstentions, ushering in a non-member observing state, Palestine. Palestine is today a state. That brings the legitimacy of Palestine up, and the delegitimation of Israel is coming every day by Likud policies. So where do I stand? I am not anti-Zionist, I'm anti-revisionist Zionism. Have a look at the Lord Balfour Declaration. 4 lines. Some of the most talented diplomatic formulation I've read in my life. Lord Balfour says a Jewish homeland with no prejudice to the existing communities and with no prejudice to Jewish communities elsewhere. The so-called revisionists started working on that one immediately to reject it. And they reaped the harvest predicted by Lord Balfour. Tremendous prejudice to existing communities and to Jewish communities anywhere in terms of atrocities committed. You can look at all of it, and I use it now just as a formula, 4 jobs to be done. How do you do those 4 jobs? Well, that is my task then. So I then go to my solution. The Transcend is the name of the organization I stand for. Transcend means go beyond. The solution is called 2620. 2 states, Palestine and Israel, with the kind of borders I indicated, and with cantons. Why Israeli cantons on the West Bank? Because there is sacred territory. Why Palestinian cantons in the northwest? That's where many of them came from. There would be, of course, 2 capitals in West and East Jerusalem. And there would be the right of return for both. And as Arafat always said, the right of return is non-negotiable. A capital in East Jerusalem is non-negotiable. About the numbers returning, we can discuss. Maybe we can also discuss the number of returning Jews. There are 13.9 million Jews in the world, 7.1 inhabitants in Palestine, 25% of them are Arab. And then you have 6 million Jews in the biggest diaspora, which is in the United States. Now, 620, a Middle East community consisting of Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine fully recognized as Benelux. Jordan as Italy, and just as the European community has the arrogant France, the Middle East community could have the arrogant Egypt. Now, Israel's policy is exactly the opposite, is to destabilize all countries, keeping Jordans in abeyance with the hope that that could be a Palestinian state. But there is also the Israeli vision in Genesis 15:18, from the Nile to the Euphrates, that covers 9 countries by today's map. A little bit big. Israel has never declared its borders. So Israel, that doesn't work. You are driving towards a cliff, not a fiscal one, but a suicide cliff. Stop it. 20. Whereas a Middle East community would have some resemblance to the European community. And when I'm in Arab countries, I'm saying, I have a dream of 2 Arab presidents standing up saying, Israel, you have behaved so atrociously that you have to become a member of the family. 20 is another European success, because the European community has been a success, not to the outside, but to itself, except for one major mistake they made, having a single currency without a single treasury. Now, instead of single currency, they could have had a common currency. But let's leave that aside. Lots of technicalities. We can take it up in the workshops. The point about it now is that Europe has one more institution. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. And I had my little contribution in that one, suggesting in 1967, I think as the first one, that one solution to Europe's Cold War could be a United Nations Security Commission for Europe. You see, I make proposals. They are flying in the air. And I have experienced more than once silence, joking, totally ridiculous, and of course suspicion, what is he really after? Until in the end the politician stands up and says, it has always been my opinion. There are many of those politicians, short on opinions, but willing to stand up. So the reason why you have proposals flying in the air is for them to tap them down. 20. An organization for security and cooperation in West Asia, including Cyprus, Turkey, including, they are not Arab, including certainly Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and a number of other countries. So those would be the border of the Israeli border countries and the border of those countries. And it will go as far as the olive tree grows, and a little bit further. Now that can be helped by planting some olive trees, so it's no particular problem. Changing reality a little bit. You will understand the logic. The two-state solution is too asymmetric. A very powerful Israel and not very powerful Palestine. But both states, and of course as a member state, a 6-state community can do what they cannot do. Decisions will have to be made by consensus. But there is a balance between an Israel supported by the US and 5 Arab countries. They could have commissions for return, for running two separate Jerusalems as a confederation of two capitals, something new in the world, probably internationalizing the old city, doing everything for ecumenical work, making a book citing the best aspects from the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. There are a couple of things not worth quoting. There are other things very much worth quoting. I'm a little bit specialist on that one, and I have a book downstairs called Globalizing God, where I try to mention the best things that I find in the three Christianities, in Islam, in Judaism, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Taoism, in Shinto, in Polynesian culture, in humanism, in secularism, in Zulu culture. But leaving that aside, you will understand that this 20 would be a kind of umbrella over the other two, 620. I'll make a guess. This is where it will end up. I say, not very modestly. And the reason why I say it, I haven't heard anything better. If somebody in the room has something better, I'll be delighted. I'm not that dogmatic. Quite willing to listen to alternatives. So I have mentioned now, I could put down the Nordic countries. I have a lot of that. We hear from the rest of the world, that's not strange, because you are so cold-blooded. You don't have hot blood in your veins, you probably have ice water. Now, we had 800 years of warfare, and anybody who knows a little bit about Nordic history will know that it was not that easy. The same goes for ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Well, they are now quite old already, from 1967. In 1987, I was in Malaysia, I think it was, and somebody was a speechwriter for the president to celebrate the 20th anniversary. And he said, we still have lots of internal struggle and there's not much more trade among us. So what good is there to say? Could we include that there hasn't been any war? And I said, I think you can. I think it's a rather major achievement. Write it up, write it high, celebrate it, applaud yourselves. Not a bad achievement. It was based on equity, harmony, overcoming some traumas, processing them, and solving some conflicts between the countries. If you look at Philippines from the inside, Thailand from the inside, Indonesia from the inside, if you take a lot of that, 10 of them all together, I'll not mention it, doesn't look good. But one looks good, Malaysia. Why does it look good? It looks good because they had a genius politician, Mahathir. They had a big problem, very cultured, educated, and very rich Chinese minority. They had had genocide against the Chinese in Indonesia, and something close to it in 1969. He made a decision that rather than squeezing out the Chinese and taxing them or whatever, lift up the Malays. He had positive discrimination for a period of 10, 20 years, or how long it was. Positive discrimination of Malay enterprises. Of course the Chinese complained, and he lifted them up culturally. The result? No genocide, no demonstration. I won't say exactly love, but no violence. If the Weimar Republic had done that to the Germans, lifting up the Germans rather than blaming the Jews, Shoah might not have happened. If in addition the Versailles Treaty had been abrogated, it would have helped a lot. Massive non-violence would have helped a lot. Economic boycott of Hitler would have helped a lot. Nothing of it happened. Now, I get a certificate of anti-Semitism for saying such things because the Nazis said that the Jews are monopolizing economic and cultural position. They were not monopolizing, but they were high, they were clever, they were skillful. But if you are a minority and you're high on economy and culture, and the others, the majority, are high on political and military power, what do you expect? You have a recipe for a disaster. You can find it in English history too, if you want to look a little bit. A recipe for a disaster. Take it seriously. So I got my certificate from those who think they are licensed to issue such certificates. Please, 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 dear anti-Semites, give up that joke. Give it up. Cooperate in finding out what happened. We have to learn how to avoid genocide. And in doing that, we sometimes have to say things that you might not like. And don't try to micromanage my words. I enjoy academic freedom and freedom of speech. These are great things of our democracies. We have to know how to handle the present conflicts of Israel. And Israel is expanding, occupying, and at the same time laying siege on Gaza. That's not equity, harmony. It contributes more trauma. It makes all the things in that formula worse. 2620 might be an alternative. And we have to learn how to fight anti-Semitism. I agree with you. I'm not the slightest anti-Semitic. But I can tell you one thing. If you want to fight anti-Semitism, don't have any part of international Jewry confirm the prejudices against Jews. If one prejudice is that Jews have a tendency to get others in debt bondage, then maybe Goldman Sachs confirms that. And if one prejudice is that they have a tendency to control media, then US mainstream media confirm that. Not The Guardian in England. You know what I'm thinking right now. The point about it is this, that New York Times has changed and is lashing out against these self-appointed anti-Semites with very strong words. And the chief rabbi of Austria in his magazine has said, it's high time we Jews give up the victim role and see ourselves more realistically. If Goldman Sachs came out as the first to control finance capitalism, they would do a better job preventing anti-Semitism than anybody else. So I'm repeatedly calling on Goldman Sachs, and I have just done it. So having said this, I've come to the end of my talk, and I am benefiting a little bit from the fact that the people introducing me used 11 minutes and come to the end. And I want to thank you for your patience and say that for the details, there are 4 workshops tomorrow. Thank you.